All right, so today we have one of our own military moms joining us, Lisa Crooks. Lisa and her husband were mill to mill in the Army back in 2007 when they were unexpectedly deployed at the same time. As you know, this is no small feat to leave your kids, but on top of that, Lisa only had 30 days notice to do so. So before I tell your whole story, Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you.
Of course. So
Great to be here.
yes. Oh my goodness. So I am so excited to hear your deployment story. Lisa and I chatted for a little bit before this podcast, and she retired back in 2016, correct?
2013.
2013. But obviously, this is still a passionate topic for her to reach out and really just educate you on what you're getting into and the possibilities, because the worst case scenario is for both you and your spouse to be deployed at the same time. So Lisa, just thank you so much in advance for sharing your story with everyone, as I know we're going to learn a whole bunch. So without further ado, what is your story? What is your family makeup? Tell us kind of what happened.
Yeah, so my husband Rory and I have been married for 16 years. Our 16th wedding anniversary is actually on Friday in a couple of days. We have two sons, Ryan, who is 14 and a half, and Daniel, who's 13. And as mentioned, I retired from the Army in 2013, so 7 years ago, after 20 years of active duty service. And my husband Rory is still in active duty. He's stationed at Joint Base Langley Eustis here in Virginia. And we PCSed here from Fort Riley, Kansas last summer. So we're going on about a year being stationed here. But as far as my deployment story goes, it's a bit convoluted, so I'll try to explain it as best I can. It began in January of 2007, just 3 months after my son Daniel was born. And at the time, Rory and I were stationed at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He was a student at the Command and General Staff College, and I was permanent party working for the Combined Arms Center G1 as the chief of the Personnel Strength Management Division. I had just returned from maternity leave when our command received a tasking for an individual augmentee to fill the position of J1 director for the Iraq Assistance Group in Baghdad. It was a one-year tasking. So the requirement was for an AG lieutenant colonel, AG being Adjutant General Branch, Human Resources. Like I said, it was for a lieutenant colonel, but I was a major, so initially did not think I was eligible, but postpartum anyway. We only had a few AG lieutenant colonels, and none of them were available for a variety of reasons. So our command submitted a reclama to higher headquarters asking to be relieved of the tasking. And this went up and down and back and forth for a couple of weeks until Big Army came back and said, no, you're still on the hook. The tasking had bounced around to a couple of other installations already. It was a priority fill. And they said, well, we'll take a major. And there were only a handful of us. So still, I was still postpartum. Another officer was identified and for a variety of reasons was not able to deploy. So I was next on the list. And so my number was called. By this time it was February of 2007. So I only had 30 days notice to pack my bags. And my chain of command really did not want to send me because I had just had a baby, and not to mention I also have a toddler home, and of course, there's always that looming possibility that your spouse could get deployed as well. So I was very grateful that they worked it out with Big Army, so to speak, to divide, to split the tasking, the one-year tasking, into 2 6-month rotations. And so I deployed on that first rotation, and eventually they found another officer who wasn't even assigned yet to the command to go on that second rotation. So, like I said, I only had 30 days and reported to Iraq the 1st of April. But as far as how I felt goes, honestly, I was devastated. Of course, I was still postpartum and hormonal. I couldn't believe it. I also felt very guilty. I did not want to leave my children at all, or my husband. I just felt awful about that. But on a professional side, I was also very proud, though. I was excited. I thought it would be a very professionally rewarding experience. But there was also some of that fear too, fear of the unknown. I had a friend who had been killed downrange, and so that was also on the forefront of my mind. But yeah, at the end of the day, I was proud, to be called upon to serve our nation during a time of war.
Now, was
So
that your first deployment?
that was my second deployment. My first deployment was to Bosnia Herzegovina, a peacekeeping mission, 1998 to 99. I was on a 9-month deployment. But that was very different. I was single, didn't have any responsibilities. I didn't even have my dog at that point. So yeah, very, very different this time around, especially, going from peacetime to wartime, very different circumstances.
So at that time in 2007, you were postpartum, and I
Mhm.
believe currently we have a waiver in place where they can't be deployed for 6 to 12 months. I'm not sure what the Army is since I'm Air Force, but Air Force is 12 months. Was there nothing like that at the time?
No, and that's the crazy thing. And actually, there was some good that came out of my deployment because eventually the Army did change its postpartum deployment deferment policy. At that time, it was only 4 months. And oddly enough, women were exempt from physical training tests for 6 months. So the Army's policy wasn't even consistent within its own branch. But when I got to Iraq, my boss, it was a 1-star general, and he was shocked. He said, "Why are you even here? Like, how can this be possible? You just had a baby." And I said, "Sir, it's only 4 months." And he was enraged. And there were other general officers downrange. Once they got the word that I had just had a baby, they're like, something's got to change. And eventually it did. Wasn't as liberal a change as I had hoped for, but at that time too, the Department of Defense policy was, there was just no consistency. There was no standard. While I was there in June of 2007, the Navy went from 6 months to 12 months. The Marines went from 12 months to 6 months. They reduced it. And the Air Force was at 12 months. So yeah, I believe now the Army policy is 6 months. And I think the maternity leave is either 8 weeks or 12 weeks. And at the time, it was only 6 weeks for me. So with both of my boys, I actually burned my own leave and added 2 to 3 weeks for maternity leave. But yeah, so it was, yeah, it was kind of crazy.
That's a whole nother topic, is the whole
Right.
maternity leave. That's another
Yeah.
topic for another day. So you got that notification, you went downrange, but you said some good came out of it. Was that because the attention that you brought to the forefront, or what good came out of it? You mentioned it.
Well, the good that came out of it was that the Army did change its policy. Ironically enough, at Human Resources Command, which was an organization I had to work with a lot in my position as the J1, I had a friend who worked there, and she too was shocked. Like, what are you doing here? So she worked with Army G1. Was like, look, we got to change this policy. This is crazy. And the G1's response back was, well, we really can't afford to do it. It's a readiness issue. But when I got back from Iraq, I just, by happenstance, talked to a general officer who was, we were at Fort Lewis by this time, and he was there on behalf of the Chief of Staff of the Army. And we just had an officer call, and he was, introducing himself to everyone, and he just started asking me questions. Oh, he said, you just got back from Iraq, and he's asking if I had kids. And then when he asked for the ages of the kids, and again, he was shocked too. And so he gave me a 3x5 card. He said, I want your name, your number, tell me, your story. And next thing I knew, 2 months later, the policy changed. And so I did talk to him. I reached out and thanked him. He said, no, he said, thank you, because we weren't aware of this. And so until we hear these kind of things, we don't know, how devastating certain policies can be.
So
So that was the good news story.
that's crazy. Well, so now everyone in the Army knows who helped change that policy.
Well, I think I might have been the straw that broke the
You were
camel's
the
back.
ball that got it rolling.
Maybe, yeah. I think there were already some things in place, but I think when they got wind of this, it was like, okay, we got to do something.
No. And you know what? You hit the nail on the head when you said they just don't know.
Right,
And that's what I'm hoping, you telling your story can start those conversations that they may not know something exists, correct? So like you
right,
said, nothing is really aligned. Everything isn't consistent, not only just within each branch, but the DoD in general. We are not in agreement with what we should be doing for postpartum women.
Right.
Just blows my mind. But
Yeah.
okay, so at that time, how did you communicate with your family? Because you had mentioned in 2007, there really wasn't the best communication. So it's almost like today's isolated locations you deploy to.
Right. Yeah. So there was no Facebook. There might have been Skype, but again, I had to be very careful. I worked in an office where, I had some, secure phone, a lot of classified information around. So it was mostly by calling up the morale line and, getting connected to my family that way by phone, and a lot of email, also handwritten letters. My mom and dad, they were our family care plan. So they would always send us pictures of the boys, at least once a week or once every other week, I'd get handwritten letters from family.
So now,
But
did you and your husband deploy at the same time, or was it
he de-
separate?
he deployed 3 months after I did.
Okay. And you
Yeah.
didn't have any intention on that happening either, correct?
No, and that's why I say it's such a convoluted, crazy story. Yeah. So like I said, at the time I deployed, he was a student at the Command and General Staff College. And so he was working on his master's degree on top of the requirements for CGSC itself. So our boys went with my parents. They stayed with our parents. They were our family care plan. They lived in Arizona so that he could finish up, what he had to do. And then he PCS'd to Fort Lewis, Washington while I was deployed. So he handled the PCS move all by himself, with the help of our parents. And when he got to Fort Lewis, he really wanted to join the 3rd Stryker Brigade combat team. He was on orders for another unit. He got what he wanted. The unit was actually downrange. They were on the tail end of their deployment, and much to everybody's surprise, they called him and all the other new majors that joined the unit. They said, instead of staying there and waiting for us to redeploy, we want you downrange to help us push soldiers and equipment back to the States. So I was ecstatic. I mean, I was really happy to have him join me, but the rest of the family, not so much. Yeah, so it was almost like a second honeymoon in some ways. But
So now I know your 3-month-old, had no emotion during this. He just knew you guys weren't there. But how did your toddler react?
um, I don't think he really understood either. And in fact, last night I asked him about it. I said, again, remind me, do you remember anything about that? He said, no, not at all. So leaving wasn't really an issue for the kids. I think, again, they were just too young to understand anything. Reintegration, though, was a completely different story.
So how
That
did
was the
that
hard
work?
part. So, Daniel by that time was, he was 11 months old, going on 12 months, going on a year. Ryan was a little older than 2. They're 16 months apart. It was hard. He did not naturally come to me. I think he was kind of afraid of me. It took about 2 to 3 months for him to get used to me. And that was the heartbreaking part. Was I just kind of expected this wonderful homecoming. The boys missed me, and he just kind of looked at me like, "Who are you?"
That's always the worst when you have it built up in your mind and it just does not come to fruition like that.
Right. Yeah. So that was the hard part. Other than that, I think all being said, reintegration went well. But again, it was kind of complicated because I wasn't coming home back to Kansas. I was coming back to a new house, a place I'd never lived before, Washington State. And I had about two months worth of leave accrued. So I took a full 60 days before starting my job. And that's when it really started getting hard, was, starting that new job, having to get used to new bosses, and the weather too. The weather's a lot different out there. Lots of lots of depressing rain. So
Yeah, it's a big change all at once. Like you said, not just coming back home to grown babies, but a location and job. That's a little bit too
right.
much at once.
It really was. I mean, I wonder how I did it. I mean, I had a baby, I deployed, I PCS, started a new job. It's just, all these, a confluence of all these major life events at once.
So after going through all that change and deploying right postpartum, at least that part has changed.
Mhm.
What do you think the DoD can change in their policy to help postpartum women or just women in general that, have children? What policies could they change to make it easier?
I really would like to see something that I believe the Canadian Army does, and that's giving women a sabbatical. I think it would be beneficial to maybe take a year off if you want to. I also think it might be a little bit harder to come back in after taking a year off. A lot of women might not want to come back, but it was hard for me both times to go back to work after both boys were born. And of course, again, the policy was different after my children were born, not having enough or not having as much maternity leave and postpartum deployment deferment. But I would like to see that. I think that would be a great recruitment tool. I think it would also be a great retention tool to allow women to focus on being just mom for a while. Because as you know, it's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know the Marines
Balance
right
that.
now is looking at that, and it's that double-edged sword. Those that don't understand say, hey, they won't come back. But those that do
Right.
understand, like you mentioned, it's a retention tool. Like, I am
Yes.
more able to come back because I'm ready. Don't make me come
Right.
back at the 3-month mark when my child is finally understanding who I am and that concept of you being gone. Right? It's just a bad
Exactly.
time frame.
Yeah. And, I also think it depends on at what point a woman is in her career. For me, I had my first child, I'll say Ryan was born in 2005. So by then I had been in the Army for 12 years already. So I wasn't really going to throw 12 years away. I mean, I would have come back, I think. So,
Absolutely. Well, we'll see where that comes out to from the Marines and see if everyone else comes on board. But
right,
I absolutely agree with you on the 1 year postpartum,
right.
and hopefully all branches having a 1 year postpartum for deployment as well. So
Yes,
those two match up.
that would be great.
All right. So to wrap up, Lisa, what are your tips for moms in the same situation when you are dual mil being deployed at the same time? Anything to help them just get through it and to manage their emotion, their spouse's emotions, and their kids' emotions?
Yeah. I think, well, first of all, you've got to have a great family support system. I mean, that's what really helped us. My parents, my in-laws, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, friends as well. And for me too, as a Catholic Christian, my faith was very important to me. I mean, that really helped me get through a deployment. But also physical fitness. I think that is key. I mean, of course, that kind of goes along with being in the military. I mean, it's kind of forced upon us to stay physically fit, but running or doing whatever, whatever your passion is, focusing on that. If you have a certain hobby, whether it's reading or sewing or crocheting or whatever it may be, but just trying to find that balance. And I know it can be really hard, but if you can achieve that balance, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, I think that's the key.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I hope everyone took something away from this podcast episode. Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your story. I know
Oh,
you
well,
said
thank
it's,
you so much.
yeah, it's convoluted, but it's just so crazy, and that's life, right?
Right.
Nothing can be predicted these days.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you so much, Lisa.
All
If
right.
anyone
Thanks,
has any
Drea.
questions,
Have a great day.
perfect.